morning and welcome to our Closing Your Books webinar for the Fundware software. I'm Kathy Dwyer and I work out of the Zobrio Boston office. As we get started, I just want to mention that I'm going to go through a presentation overview of the closing of the fiscal year. And if you could hold your questions to the end of the webinar, you can either ask out loud or we have a tool where you can type in your comments. Okay, as we get started, just wanted to discuss a couple of pre-close activities. In order to close your books, what we need to do is ensure that the new fiscal year is opened. And the reason for that is as we close, we're going to roll balances forward from one fiscal year to the next. In order to roll those balances, the new year needs to be opened. So to do that, what we do is we go into the general ledger, we go to maintenance, and we go to date tables. And that's how Fundware refers to opening of the year. It refers to them as date tables. And what you're going to do here is in the lower left-hand side, you're going to click on the New button. And to the right of that, what the program will do is open up a small dialog box where it wants you to identify your ID type and the number of adjustment periods that you'd like to have for your new fiscal year. You select the radio button for next year and you click OK. From there, what the system will do is it will add your new fiscal year into the date tables. And essentially what it is it opens a single month or month records each month of your fiscal year. Your adjustment periods can be anywhere from 0 to 4 periods. Oftentimes it's referred to as period 13, and sometimes what people will do is make their year-end journal entries rather than to the last month of your fiscal year. They might reserve them into an adjustment period just to isolate them. Okay. But once you do that and you click on OK, what's going to happen is the system's going to go ahead and open the date tables, and that's going to allow you to start your close process. And also what it will allow you to do is if you need to do some data input into the first month of your new fiscal year prior to the close, the date tables are what's going to allow that to happen. Okay. The next pre-close task is identifying what we call our closing ID per fund. And what the closing ID is basically is on a fund-by-fund basis, it's the fund balance account that you close your revenue and expense accounts into. And what you'll find in some instances, you might have a basic close where there's a single equity account per fund. In other more complicated chart environments, you might find that there's multiple equity accounts within the same fund. Okay. So the question is, well, how do you identify what these closing IDs are? Well, what I recommend is to go on into your chart of accounts, and the white stripe below your account titles, like your various dimensions, and in this example we have fund, department, sub-department, and object. The white stripe below those column titles allows you to key in values, and your grid responds back with whatever you're asking for. And here with this particular screenshot is we're filtering on system reserved, which is it's actually system reserved is telling us whether we have an asset or a liability or a fund balance. Some folks will refer to it as NA for net assets. But what we're doing here is we're searching on FB for fund balance accounts, and the grid has come back with really, with our 4 funds, a simple chart in the sense that there's commonality in that all funds are closing to a 3110 account. You'll notice the department, the sub-department, and the object are all consistent, and what varies is the fund number. So in this example, our closing ID becomes A, which is the ID type, XX, which is a masking or a wildcard for the fund, And the reason we do that is we always enter an ID type and a masking of the fund because later in the process we tell the system which funds we're closing. But from beyond that, beyond the ID type and beyond masking the fund number, this screenshot shows commonality in that it's always Department 0, it's always Subdepartment 0, and Object Code 3110. So based on that, because there's commonality, we can close all 4 funds in one swoop. Okay. This next screenshot shows a bit more of a complicated chart. In our example, let me just kind of explain what I'm trying to illustrate here is I've used the search functions within the chart of accounts, which again is the white stripe below the column titles. And I was looking for Fund 20, which happens to represent a grant fund. I wanted to look for a specific equity account or fund balance, so I put in 3570. And then I did use the system reserved, which system reserved is an attribute, and the first attribute is always the account type. So what I wanted to do is get the grid to show me all the various fund equity accounts within Fund 20. And think of it in terms of this fund illustrates it's a grant fund where it's departmentalized each grant, and the budget control dimension is differentiating one grant from another. Beyond that, with your account dimension all the way through the program dimension, that's where we see the commonality in that it's 3570 and a bunch of trailing zeros. So what ends up happening is in this environment, I do have multiple equity accounts that I'm closing into per fund. I don't want to close each grant individually. I want to be able to close this account in just one shot. So what we do with the Fundware Closing ID is we use the masking characters in the department and in the budgetary control fields. So you'll look to the left here is there's our A for ID. We mask XX for our fund. And because the department is variable, we use XXX. Because the budget control is variable, we use XXX. And then where we have commonality, we use 3570 and all the trailing zeros. Okay. So again, X's or masking characters, use that when there's, the numbers are not absolute, but when you have an absolute number, and that includes your zeros on the end here, be sure to use, in this case, 3570 and all trailing zeros. Okay. So that's how you can go about identifying your closing ID. Couple things to consider when you go to actually push the buttons and close your books is it's highly recommended that all users be out of Fundware at that time. And that includes all modules, AP, accounts receivable, payroll. You really want to do this when everybody is completely out of Fundware. You do want to sign in with a business date that represents the last day of the fiscal year that you're closing. And then finally, something to consider, it's not a requirement, but it's a recommendation, is if you log into Division 00 Systems Administration, there's a function in there that allows you to back up your division. And I'm a big fan of using this backup at least once, which is prior to starting the close process. And what it does is it doesn't spin the backup off to a disk anywhere or offline. It's actually putting it within a subdirectory within your Fundware system. And the reason we do that is if anything happens to go wrong, you've selected a bad closing ID or anything that might happen, it's real easy to restore back to a systems administration backup, and it's almost like a do-over. You might also consider, too, is if you're in an environment that has multiple funds and you're closing funds individually, you might consider starting with a backup, closing half your funds, and then doing another backup. And again, not anticipating any problems, but it's always our trap door in case there is a problem, and it's a point to go back to in time so that we always get our do-overs. Okay. Now, from here, the actual close itself consists of 2 steps. It's called post revenue and expense, and secondly, roll beginning balances. And we access these menu choices by going to the general ledger and year-end processing. The first step is to run post revenue and expense. And basically what happens there is here's where you identify your closing ID. And again, remember, you always enter your ID type A or whatever other ID types you're closing. You mask your fund number, and then the rest of the closing ID can be a combination of masking characters or absolute values, as we discussed a few moments ago. Your closing year end, from the drop list, you select the last day of the year you're closing. If you're closing one fund at a time through the fund range, you would say, for instance, Fund 1 to Fund 1, or if your equity accounts, fund balance accounts are all consistent across funds, you can make a single close by putting in a range of fund numbers. It is highly recommended that initially, when you run this job, you leave the preview box checked. The preview box basically will produce a report of your closing entries without actually making the journal entries to close. So it allows you to view what's going to happen before those journal entries get created. Okay. You'll also note towards the bottom of the screen there's an introduction of include, exclude attributes. The attributes are a bit more complicated feature. Probably 9 out of 10 times users don't use this particular functionality. In general, what I'll tell you it is if you have a fund where you have multiple fund balance accounts that you're closing into, and there's no commonality, maybe in one instance there's a group of accounts that close out to a base number of 3510, and maybe in another instance there's a bunch of accounts that you're closing to 3570. Because there's not commonality throughout the entire fund, we can introduce attributes to basically allow us to close a fund more than once. And what you're doing is you're closing groups of accounts once, and then another group of accounts again, and so on and so forth. But that's kind of a more complicated feature that we can take offline and discuss if you have that condition. Okay, now, this slide basically discusses what I was, or illustrates what I was just discussing. But from here, what ends up happening is when you, again, identify your closing ID and you hit the preview button, the system is going to create a report called GLREEX. This report does not automatically display on the screen. What you need to do is go up under your print manager and locate that report. With that report open on the screen, the parameter page or your top page is going to indicate that this is a trial or a live run. What you want to do is click on the binoculars on the screen or scroll up and down. And what you're looking for is the existence of any accounts that have a title of created by posting. And these are accounts that the system is attempting to generate based on the closing ID that you've fed into the system. And I'll tell you straight up, you don't want to see any of those. What they generally indicate is we've fed the system a bad closing ID, or perhaps there is a missing fund balance account in a fund somewhere. I would recommend, before you rerun this job and uncheck that preview box, resolve those created by postings. Take a look at your closing ID. Did you get it right? Take a look at the fund through the chart of accounts. Is there something missing? And definitely get those resolved before you come back and rerun the post revenue and expense and uncheck that preview button. Okay. Now, from here, what ends up happening is your post revenue and expense is by fund. And again, you can enter in a range of funds or you can do fund by fund. But typically what we recommend is close all your post revenue expense for all your individual funds, and then go to step 2, which is roll beginning balances. And what roll beginning balances does is, in essence, is it takes your balance sheet, any accounts that end up with a balance as of the end of the fiscal year, and it brings them forward into your new fiscal year. And it brings them forward into a time period called beginning balances. And what's significant there is you can report on them separately. If you needed to run, say, a trial balance or a balance sheet that says, show me just opening balances, we can do that. Okay. Do note that, well, the post-revenue and expense is closed by fund, the roll balances are by ID type. Okay, now from here, what we want to talk about is a little post-close activity. Once that you've gone through and you've closed your books, a couple things to consider is Fundware does have a function called lock periods and years to posting. Okay. And what this is it's a bit of a toggle in the sense that you can go into a particular fiscal year and lock all the months to posting, or you can lock individual months to posting. And what that simply does is it prevents anybody from mistakenly posting a transaction to a closed month or a closed fiscal year. And what's pertinent here is the fact that it's a toggle. So if you lock it down after you close, and later maybe the auditors come in and they have an adjustment for you, you can untoggle or reopen that particular period to posting and go ahead and reclose. Significant point there with Fundware is it does indeed allow you to close your books more than once. And there's intelligence in the software so that if you happen to close your books and make a journal entry into your last month of the fiscal year and you need to reclose, the system will only bring forward the net difference. Okay. And then finally, just something to mention here is for those clients that use the budget control functions in the general ledger, this budget control must be restarted at the start of each new fiscal year. And to do that, you go into your general ledger, you go to budget control, and start the control year. The system will ask for an ID type, and it will ask which fiscal year you're restarting. Click on that, OK it, and that will engage all your budgetary control functions, and which really manifest when you go to do things like enter in invoices or journal entries. The system will test the entry back against your budget to see if there's enough money to complete the transaction. Okay, so that basically is an overview of the close. What we wanted to mention here is upcoming webinars that are available. As you can see, on Thursday, December 4th, we have an IT webinar. On Thursday, January 5th, we have an Office with Windows 8 webinar. And Jim Bonhouse, who's our marketing director, will be scheduling additional webinars in the future. For those clients that might be interested in consulting services, we ask that you call Matt Kreutzer or send him an email. And this slide will show you Matt's email and phone number. We do offer consulting services that can be on-site or remote, much using the same tool we're using here today, which is our Zoom. Okay, so at this point, we take it to our questions and answers portion of the webinar. And I can see nobody has any questions. Let me offer this. My email address is Kathy, K-A-T-H-Y, Dwyer, D-W-Y-E-R, @zobrio.com. If you have any questions and would like to follow up with me offline, please feel free to do that. We'll do our best to answer your questions. And in the meantime, we'd like to thank you for attending the webinar and look forward to seeing you in future webinars. Take care, and we'll talk again. Bye-bye.